Good evening, everyone. Thank you for joining us today for today's book discussion. We have with us Dr. Lawrence Hamilton, who is the author of the book How to Read Amartya Sen. He is a professor of political studies at the University of Wits and the University of Cambridge. He has also written books like Freedom is Power and Are South Africans Free? The discussion will be moderated by our very own Pratap Bhanu Mehta, who is the professor of political science at Ashoka University. There would first be a conversation between our two guests, and we would then take questions from our audience. So I would request you to type your questions in the Q&A box. Over to you, Professor.
Yeah, very good evening to everyone. It's heroic of you to come out for this discussion. And I think it's a testament both to Amartya's importance and I think to the buzz Lawrence Hamilton's book is generating. How to Read Amartya Sen. I know most of you haven't had a chance to sort of get this book because of the lockdown and so forth, but it is a wonderful introduction, actually more than an introduction. I think a pretty systematic analysis of Amartya Sen's main ideas. And so we are really privileged to welcome Professor Hamilton to this conversation. So Lawrence, first of all, welcome to Ashoka. Wish we could welcome you in person and hope we can make amends on some future date. Um, can you sort of tell us your journey into this book? I mean, Amartya is such a colossus and one of the most studied, celebrated economists across the world. Why did you feel the need for a book of this kind? What do you think this book brings to the discussion of Amartya that might be somewhat distinctive in the kind of Amartya industry, as it were, the way in which Amartya's ideas are received and disseminated?
Many thanks, Pratap, and many thanks for the invitation. Good evening, all. It's a pleasure to be here. And as you say, it would have been so much better if I'd been able to be there in person. I at least would have had the opportunity to visit India for the first time ever. But this is a great second best. As I say, thanks again for the invitation. This book, I came across Amartya Sen's work just under 30 years ago as a student, and he, in fact, supervised me for, when he was a master at Trinity College, Cambridge, he supervised me for one of my master's essays, which was on his work, and that became, after some tinkering and some criticism, it became my first published academic article in Government and Opposition. So my ties, he also actually supervised me for a year of my PhD. Right. My PhD was on needs, and it became a book called The Political Philosophy of Needs. So early on, his work was very, very important to me, and my work on needs and freedom has, in a sense, built upon his work, and criticisms in small ways of parts of his work that have been really, really fundamental to me. I do political theory. I'm mainly a political theorist, and what I found so important and fascinating about Amartya's work is, if not always explicitly there, is essentially thinking about politics, economics, philosophy, and in particular, obviously, economics, from the perspective of the global South, through the lens of development. And I think that's relatively unusual, to be honest. And these were, as you know, I don't need to tell any of you guys this, these have been extremely important ideas. And so my access into them was, in terms of that, that's the history of why I became interested, in the history of their import in my own work. But the other sort of, I suppose, more general point to make is that, as I say, they're ideas that, even if informed by analytical political philosophy and informed by a lot of the mainstream and non-mainstream economics tradition, they're ideas that are grappling with problems in the global south, in particular in India. So in the book, I don't actually have a chapter on development, but the introduction is essentially all about development studies. And it's about how he is in various kinds of ways attempting to reorient development studies through a criticism of so much of the foundations of development studies. And in doing that, he's having to, of course, criticize so much of the foundations of received opinion in economics and in economic thought.
Okay.
Sorry.
No, sorry, please go ahead.
So I was just, I mean, and the other important thing to say is not just that about the global south and these alternative ideas, but also he has written so much in such varied fields and sometimes in quite abstract ways that when Polity approached me to write this book, I did actually take quite a long time to say yes, partly because I'd never done this kind of thing before. I'd always written my sort of own ideas, if it were, and often linked to South Africa, etc. So I did take quite a long time to say yes, but I think what really hooked me into the project was the sense that, if possible, if I could make these ideas accessible to a broader audience, and in particular, and this is why this edition is so important, a broader Indian audience, I think would be at least some kind of service rendered.
Okay. No, thanks for that. And at some point we should, I think, have a kind of discussion of where we sort of situate Amartya in some ways, right? I mean, kind of in the global south, or if he's an heir to tradition, which set of traditions and how that might affect his work. But I want to pick up on one idea that is central to Amartya's work, but that is also central to your own work, which is the idea of freedom. I mean, you've written a wonderful book on freedom. And one of the fascinating things about Amartya's work is that if there's a kind of running thread that connects the disparate sort of interests he's had, it is in this idea of freedom. And how would you characterize what you take to be distinctive about Amartya's idea of freedom? What do you think he brings to the table, as it were, that you did not see in the conventional canon of political theory, or something that might have even informed your own work? So if you just wanted to kind of walk us through that, and perhaps its relevance to economics as well, since we have mostly economic students here.
Sure, yes, that's a great question. And I agree that from very early on, he discusses freedom directly in various essays. But from very early on, through his work on choice and through his work on making freedom central to an account of agency, which is then central to an account of the capabilities approach, or what becomes known as the capabilities approach, there's little doubt that freedom is a fundamental thread. Ending up in democracy and his democracy and justice discussions. He's what I find quite unique. It's commonly understood that there are three main ways of thinking about freedom: negative freedom, positive freedom, and Republican or neo-Roman freedom. We can go into the details of that. But what's interesting about his account is that he very graciously incorporates or enables us to see how all of those accounts of freedom, whether you're free if you're unimpeded in the negative sense, you're free if you're able to self-realize in the positive sense, or if you're free if you're living in a condition of non-slavery in the neo-Roman or Republican sense, are all part and parcel of a broader conception of freedom that he calls effective power. Okay, so he actually specifies that in the idea of justice, but it goes back to much earlier work in the 70s on criticisms of what he calls the freedom as control account, and then the negative freedom account. And essentially what he's doing is he's not doing what is normally the case in a lot of political, philosophical, political, theoretical, and also a lot of economics literature, which is to, as it were, find the ultimate definitional nux or crux of freedom upon which, you know, everything else hangs, right? A sort of axiomatic definition. What he does is he talks about freedom in a much more ample way. And effectively what he's doing is he's saying that freedom is those things and more. And the and more is the most important part. The and more is the conditions and the capacities to be able to live the life that you find valuable. Okay, so, and that then is constitutive of his definition of capability.
So can I just sort of push on that idea a bit? I mean, and that's, you're right. I mean, that's one of the most attractive features of Amartya's account. But, you know, one of the kind of common criticisms or worries about that account is whether it's in a sense too expansive. So from the economics point of view, once you in a sense define or rather articulate development as the process of the expansion of freedoms in this expansive sense, whether the underlying premise is in a sense a world without deep trade-offs and choices, that one of the values of these parsimonious accounts of freedom, right, is that they actually help us see these trade-offs very clearly in some ways. And in a philosophical sense, again, once we take freedom to be effective power, is that in some senses asking almost the impossible of the idea of freedom? Now, at that intuitive level, it makes sense, as I think you say in your book, that linguistically, if you ask somebody, are you free to do something? The thought that comes to mind is exactly that. To be free is to be able to actually be in a position to achieve. But it's also not the case that that thought applies to every account of, as it were, our functioning or capabilities. I'm free to write a book. I may not be able to achieve, in a sense, that outcome. So how do you see, in a sense, the trade-off between this kind of very capacious, expansive definition of freedom? Is there something of a challenge here between balancing that and the virtues of at least that kind of definitional parsimony that many other theorists bring?
So and this characterizes a lot of other concerns of his as well. What he's most interested in doing on a lot of occasions is taking people's concerns, in this case about freedom, and seeing effectively what goal they're after. What is the ultimate goal they're after? And so this account of freedom as power is best seen as a goal that social policy, that governments, that global policymakers, etc., would be aiming their policy formation at, as well as us individuals trying to generate the possibilities for as much freedom of achievement, if you want, as possible. Doesn't follow from that, of course, that we would always necessarily achieve those outcomes, right? We may not want to, and he has a large space in the capabilities approach for our preferences to play a significant role. So just because we're free to write a book doesn't mean that we somehow have to write a book, right? Achieve the outcome of writing a book. The important thing is that we ought not to be hindered by forces outside of us, in particular, poor policy formation or poor policy generation, etc., to achieve those sorts of outcomes. So he's most determined to think that if we as individual economic and political actors are aimed at that kind of goal, and if we are as policy professionals aimed at that sort of goal, then we're going to be more determinatively predisposed to amplify the possibilities for these sorts of outcomes. I think that the parsimony that you speak of does have a kind of intellectual clarity and beauty, if you want, in many cases, but it can also have the unintended consequence of constraining us as policymakers or as intellectuals or as individuals. So what I find constantly throughout his work is this wonderful optimism, basically a kind of optimism of the human spirit, that we should aim for these goals. These are our goals, let's aim for them. We may not achieve them, but let's aim for them. And I think it's the same in the freedom account. So
no, that's terrific. So maybe we can approach the same question, and you know, in Amartya's work, all of these different concepts are closely related from a different direction, which is, so one of his big theoretical contributions, of course, was the idea of capabilities. And this may not be the occasion to go through the kind of the entire formal structure of the argument and the distinction between functionings and capabilities. But again, if you were to do for us what you did for the concept of freedom, which is just walk us through why you think the concept of capabilities was a distinctive contribution to the way we think about what we are, in a sense, aiming at in debates over distribution or the structuring of economic arrangements. How does it set it apart from, let's say, Rawls's account of primary goods or classical utilitarian accounts of welfare?
That's another great question. It's a big question as well. I'll try and be brief. So his first opponent is, as you know, classical utilitarian accounts. And he finds the notion of utility problematic. Well, he finds the notion of utility problematic early on in a number of sorts of ways. But for the purposes of developing the capability approach, he finds it particularly problematic in the sense that it's only concerned with one's, what he calls, mental outcome, and not concerned with it's impoverished in terms of its capacity to evaluate conditions, and it's impoverished in its possibility for putting in place frameworks for, you know, prescriptive frameworks for how best to improve conditions. And so what he does is he tries to revert to, instead of this notion of utility, which is fundamental to welfare economics, and he thinks is really problematic in its well, in a whole series of ways that you know about, and we can go into them in greater detail. He wants to look at the powers and the human potential that we have. And in order to see that, in order to look at that, he has to get away from this idea that revealed preference, i.e. our articulated wants, will give us everything we need to know about somebody's conditions, real conditions. You know, if I have an ordinal preference arrangement that says I like A over B over C, then that's going to give me that's going to give the analyst a full sense of what my preferences are, and thus what my needs and interests are. And he shows very clearly that fails in a number of ways to show what my needs and interests are, what they ought to be, but more importantly, it doesn't say anything really about the social conditions that gave rise to those preferences. Okay, so what he wants to then develop is some kind of approach that wants to capture both the components of each individual that gives rise to their preferences and the conditions out of which that individual is making these sorts of choices. So it comes back effectively to choice. And, just to put it in more specific writing, I tried to, it's a clunky term, capability. And he himself has said this on a number of occasions. And in the book, I try just bring it down to, more everyday language. And the two words that I come up with are potential and power. So capability points towards the more general human potential to enact agency dependent upon whether the right conditions prevail, societal and economic relations, and means to enable basic and more developed human functioning. So what he's honing in on there is not just abilities of individuals, but the things, but the potentials of individuals. And I keep saying individuals because this is a very individualistic account. He's honing in on what potentials we have and what sort of concept is going to give us the focus that we need to assess the potentials of individuals through their own eyes, and also the objective conditions out of which those potentials are being articulated. So it's, as it were, trying to give us a different conceptual basis for assessing these very important distributive and other kinds of questions that come up in policy. Because he thinks that just working from preferences or utility, both in economics and politics, is a very poor basis upon which to make those kinds of what he would call social judgments.
So, that's such a wonderfully lucid answer. How do you think the introduction of capabilities, in a sense, affects thinking about economics and at least the practice of the discipline of economics? And I'm asking this question from two different directions. So one is obviously the approach to development, where at one level it has been quite influential in getting us to think about the sorts of things that governments should, in a sense, be concerned about as objectives of policy. But the second area in which it links up to sort of the traditional discipline of economics is that there's some economists sort of the view that the introduction of the idea of capabilities doesn't make too much of a difference to the practice of the discipline of economics, which is, and Amartya in his later work also says, look, what I'm doing is in a sense redirecting the formalism of the Arrow-Debreu models to things like freedom rather than utility. So how do you think about, in a sense, his relationship to economics on these two dimensions?
That's another great question, another big question, and a much more difficult question. I think that he early on, some of his own intellectual history is helpful here. I mean, he early on manages to get to Cambridge and to spend time on. He's offered a Trinity Prize essay award, and he goes. He takes the time to spend a lot of time in philosophy, and what unlike a lot of economists, he's given the great privilege of being able to see a lot of the philosophical underpinnings of some of the conceptual frameworks that lie under or that provide the basis for a lot of economics in general, and then more particularly welfare economics. He's also influenced quite heavily by some Marxist economists in the 60s and 70s, but he doesn't actually take that route, a lot of the route that they take. He's much more interested in rethinking the accepted foundations of, in particular, welfare economics. And once he's done quite a lot of the work there, and that's obviously a lot of complex stuff around the nature of utility, revealed preference, rationality, choice, etc. once he's done quite a lot of the work around there, just to airbrush this a bit, he then, of course, sees, like others around him, I mean, there's nothing that revolutionary about what he's seeing, but he then sees that, of course, in order for you as an economist to make much impact in the real world, you've got to be making value judgments, as it were, value judgments between people. So the intersubjective valuation of goods and the evaluation of articulated preferences becomes something that you just cannot avoid. And much of what economics has been built on for the 50 years prior to that has been on exactly that point. On this famous, to quote Hahn, I think it was, he says that you know, we do lots of evaluation, but we don't pretend to be able to enter the minds of individuals. Amartya wants to do the exact opposite. He says, why can't we enter the minds of individuals? I mean, it's not exactly rocket science to get involved in this kind of evaluation. We're involved in this kind of evaluation all the time. And then Davidson's work in a philosophical sense then supports this a lot later and gives quite a lot of philosophical credence. But he's, of course, not really dealing with that. He's not that concerned with ultimately sort of proving those philosophical points. He's concerned with reorienting development studies to different sorts of goals, right? So the main goals are what I talk about in the introduction: capital fundamentalism and market fundamentalism. And he thinks that those two are problematic for a whole series of reasons. And he wants to tack some sort of middle. And again, he's nowhere near as revolutionary as some people have suggested. You know, Albert Hirschman is much more revolutionary as regards the basis of economics than Amartya Sen is. So he's not really taking all of the foundations of economics and throwing them aside. He's taking particular parts of them and saying, look, they don't make much sense. And
I think we seem to have lost Lawrence.
I kind of not sure I've answered your question. I've forgotten the last part. And you've frozen on me.
No, that's fine. I think we lost you for a second. So, so let me just build up on what you said so far, and you know, maybe this is a kind of large question, but maybe broaden out the discussion a bit. The way in which Amartya approaches almost any thinker in any stream of thought is, again, there is a generosity about acknowledging the truth that it might contain in some ways, right? But many of us have always kind of wondered about his relationship to Marx. I mean, of course, at one level, in the goals that he has set out for himself in the conception of freedom, which is, you know, in some senses, I think Marx would not only agree, but in some senses, there is a kind of language that's almost Marxist, the freedom to effectively achieve what you want to achieve on your own terms, on your own purposes. He also wrote a very interesting appreciation of Hayek, I think on the 50th anniversary of, I think it was the publication of The Road of Serfdom, acknowledging what Hayek had cured him of. As you trace his intellectual trajectory, what do you think, in a sense, took him away from a potential trajectory going down that Marxist route, you know, and which would have been a very Cambridge thing to do as well. I mean, in a sense, it was the milieu that he had arrived in Cambridge. So, you know, it's a more speculative question, but any thoughts on that?
Yeah, it's a great question, because actually I think that Marx is much more central than, as I say in the book, very early on in the book. Right. I think Marx is much more central than a lot of people let on, and even Amartya himself is willing to let on. And it's partly to do with those foundational moments, if you want. It's partly to do with, of course, the Delhi School of Economics, which is in the 60s, which is generally speaking quite a Marxist place. But there is little doubt that there is a shift that takes place. So on economic inequality, Even in the early famine literature in Amartya, you can see the language, for example, of needs often drawn in to the analysis, often articulated. This is actually partly the argument of my first published paper, which tries to reorient some of this stuff back to the language of interests and needs. And one of my concerns is why this clunky term capability? Why not just stick with needs and interests? And the answer might be exactly what you're pushing at, is that at a certain point, I'm not sure exactly when it happens, it's probably got to do with Oxford analytical philosophy and the effects of Rawls and others. At a certain point, he switches towards a non-Marxist, much more liberal understanding. But the substance of his accounts of freedom, say, his accounts, well, I mean, his accounts of capabilities and definitely his understanding of need is very clearly Marxist. What's quite interesting is that shift, of course, then is kind of much more evident when he turns his attention to more characteristically political theoretical concerns like justice and democracy. You start to see in his justice and democracy accounts much more liberal views than you might, obviously draw from the capabilities account if it's, richly and sort of optimistically analyzed. But so there's most definitely a shift that takes place. And I would say that it's got to do, as I say, with analytical political philosophy, because he does see himself as both a philosopher and an economist. And that moment, that 70s moment or late 70s moment, started by Rawls in the late 50s, comes to its flourishing at just that time. And he's also dealing with people like Jerry Cohen, who's articulating a staunch historical materialism that he's then wary of. So that's the explanation. As to where he would have gone, I don't know. I suspect he would have ended up a little bit more less focused on justice and more. We can talk about that in a moment, but more critical of deliberative views of democracy, probably.
Yeah, we'll come to that in a minute. So, just a kind of follow-up question on that. I mean, and maybe the easiest way of posing it is by thinking of Sen's relationship to Rawls, and particularly his critique of the idea of primary goods as, in a sense, a set of goods that the state should obtain for everyone. Now, one of the fascinating things about that whole sort of liberal welfarist thing, Rawls, Dworkin, Amartya Sen, is often people find it very difficult to see what's at stake in the distinction between, let's say, Amartya's position of in a sense, expanding capabilities versus Dworkin's position of distributing resources, or Rawls's emphasis on primary goods. In that space, how would you characterize what you think is distinctive about Amartya?
Thank you. That is a really excellent question. It reminds me that I didn't answer your question earlier when you made the distinction with Rawls. It's true, because of course, what all three are talking about are forms of distribution, effectively, and different ways in which you can set things up such that distribution is just or fair in different sorts of ways. There is, though, I think, something centrally important and distinctive about Amartya Sen's position that, you're right, is often missed, and is particularly often missed in politics, in political theory and political science. And that is that, and he says this a great deal, he takes issue with, let's take primary goods from Rawls as the exemplar. He takes issue with primary goods on two fronts. One front is that he says it seems to him an act of folly, in a way, to suggest that a set of universal and universalizable goods would satisfy everyone everywhere to the same degree, and thus leave them in the same position of freedom and choice or agency anywhere and everywhere. And he makes various examples, from someone, women in poverty requiring greater upliftment than someone in Harvard who comes from privilege, etc. So it's the quite normal Marxian point in a way about saying, if your outcome is some kind of equality that you're after, then you can't really start with equality. And of course, this capability approach work, it comes out of that famous essay, Equality of What?
Right.
So he's asking, what are we dealing with when we're dealing with equality? What are the central things we're trying to make at least relatively equal? And so he attacks not the right word, because Amartya doesn't do much attacking, but he criticizes Rawls for making that very, very typically liberal assumption that a set of goods, that can be articulated at the level of theory, is sufficient to meet people's needs at a basic level anywhere and everywhere. And the second really important way in which he criticizes that is to say that ironically, for the liberals' concern with preferences and wants, and for not being paternalistic about people's preferences and wants, that listing of primary goods is a perfect exemplar of the paternalism that he's trying to not get involved in, right? So if we simply sketch out the capability space and we say that, of course, everyone needs a certain amount of capability satisfaction in order to have sufficient agency, and depending on their conditions and depending on their place, that may require different things. Of course, we're still concerned with upliftment in some sense, empowerment if you want, but we're not making the assumption that we don't, that everyone's the same, which is a very strange assumption to make for liberals, B, that we don't have to ask them something about their lives or about their conditions. And that's what I think is really crucial and fundamental.
So, can I just push back a bit against that? I mean, partly to kind of interest students. I mean, do you think it's a fair criticism of Rawls? I mean, in the sense that, one could argue this way, that, look, ultimately, even when the capabilities approach is translated into policy, it fixes on a core set of enabling goods, right? That, let's say health, education, now the new index is up, which you guys might say is a more sophisticated version, but it sounds very much like a set of primary goods. And particularly if you take in Rawls's account that these goods must at least provide you a minimum basis for social self-esteem. So at one level, is it a philosophical difference without a serious policy sort of distinction? And that Rawls is actually leaving a lot of goods open to democratic negotiations. This is just at the level of a kind of basic structure. But the second way in which, in a sense, one might kind of push back is that, as you rightly said, Amartya is very concerned with ethical pluralism and the idea that, in some senses, we should avoid paternalism. But ethical pluralism can't be incompatible with, and even in Amartya's own work, isn't incompatible with perhaps being able to specify some minimal set of goods that you could, in a sense, posit as being necessary for human flourishing. Doesn't rule out asking them. And in fact, in Rawls, they are asked. It is outcome of a deliberative procedure. So, I mean, I'm just trying to sort of, just to bring out perhaps even more sharply what might be distinctive about Amartya's position on this.
So I think one way of seeing this is not so much to contrast him with Rawls, but to contrast him with what his colleague and adversary in certain ways, Martha Nussbaum, does with her capabilities approach. So in her capabilities approach, you see, they basically work together. She identifies this Aristotelian component in his work. He runs with that. And then they sort of part ways. She makes a great deal more out of the capability approach in what I see as a typically liberal, even though it's sort of philosophically illiberal, if you ask me. But anyway, at least American liberal way of dealing with this problem. She wants Amartya to be bolder about what he calls his openness, his theoretical open-endedness, right? She says, yes, you're right about these capabilities and we need to fill them in. And she fills them in with 15, I can't remember whether it was 12 or 15, but some list of basic, let's call them basic capabilities that she argues quite forcefully that, we, all of us everywhere, need to have satisfied in order for us to live a life of full flourishing, to use Aristotelian type language. Now, I think Amartya has two problems with that. Firstly, it's not just that he's quite clear that he's not about trying to articulate a thesis of full flourishing, right? So this is not a thesis that says these are the things that you require to have satisfied or to satisfy to flourish fully as a human being, because of that staunch ethical pluralism that you're talking about. But at the other level, he's very, and it's not something that he spent much time speaking about. So maybe I'm reading some of my Cambridge School training into this. But what he's doing, actually, in the book, I quote from an article of his in Feminist Economics, where he makes the point quite well, where he says that part of the reason why I insist on this openness at a theoretical level is because it's all too easy to close down the democratic process of determining our needs and interests, let's call them, or even our basic capabilities, as a democratic process, right? So remember that, I don't need to tell you this, Pratap, but the early stuff comes from a social choice type analysis. And the social choice type analysis is founded on an inherently, ironically, because of its impossibility theorem, but it's founded on a deep optimism as regards the democratic process, working out in context what our needs and interests are. Now, I think that maybe rules can be exculpated in some way. I doubt that, but it's immaterial. But if you see what Martha Nussbaum can do with the capabilities approach, I think you start to see the concerns that we ought to have about what you might call a kind of theoretical imperialism, if you want, right? A way in which too much substance in theory can license imposition by development agencies, located in America. They can license strong powers like America, suggesting that they ought to invade Iraq based upon human rights filled out via some kind of account like this. So I think it has both theoretical and practical consequences that we may be wary of.
Excellent. So before we open it up, one maybe last kind of big question, and again relating to your own work on democracy. You have quite a powerful chapter in the book. Actually, I think it's the chapter where you're probably the most critical of Amartya. As many of our participants know, Amartya has been a great advocate of deliberative democracy, particularly in his later work, The Idea of Justice. And I have, in a sense, two questions about that. I mean, one, typically theorists who are ethical, who believe in deep pluralism, one can think of Amartya's also colleague, Isaiah Berlin, end up having a slightly more tragic view of the world. That one of the consequences of ethical pluralism is that there will be forms of conflict that are somewhat more irreconcilable. And, there's no such thing as a world without loss. I've always wondered how Amartya managed, in a sense, to square the commitment to deep value pluralism with a certain kind of optimism about kind of harmonizing it through the process of deliberative democracy. And and the second question, which I think comes from your own work, where do equations of power fit in this conception of deliberative democracy?
And again, two fantastic questions. I mean, I think that you're absolutely right. There is it should ring for anyone who's done a little bit of political theory or history of political thought, that combination of trenchant ethical pluralism with this optimism in the democratic process should be ringing alarm bells right away. Because, and I think, well, first of all, the alarm bells should be ringing, but also there's something, just before I say what I mean by that, there's something also, and this is the other reason why I've always been attracted to Amartya's work and why I suppose I took this project on, something that is wonderfully appealing about his optimism all the way through. I think people underestimate the force and power and self-esteem that it takes to remain optimistic under the conditions of doing the kind of work you and I and he and lots of other people do, right? It's much easier to be pessimistic and tragic about these possibilities. But what he does, unfortunately for me, is that and I think this it has its roots in his work on famines. So what he sees in the case of famines, as you all know, is that he says his argument is that there's never been a famine in a representative democracy, and that's because in a representative democracy you have free media, and even if the numbers involved in a famine, the numbers that are affected by the famine itself may be very low as a whole, relative to the population as a whole, and may not thus have an effect on a future election. What a free press in a representative democracy does is that it makes well known what's going on, and thus that's a mechanism for holding to account the representatives to react to the famine. Okay, and the famous counterexample is the Chinese famine that kills over 30 million people. So I think it's that core plus the social choice core that goes even further back that holds all the way through, and then finds a home in the political theory language of discursive democracy, deliberative democracy. And it's that view of democracy that I find troubling. I find it troubling in and of itself because I don't think it's particularly realistic about the nature of democracy, especially representative democracy. And I actually find it troubling as regards how it fits with the rest of his work. So it's not clear to me how well it fits with the capabilities approach, because it's not clear to me how you get from let's talk about your context and the audience's context. India, it's not clear to me how you get from a situation of massive inequality, massive hierarchies created by caste and various other power relations, to generating, empowering, like the capabilities approach would want, via simply discursive or deliberative democracy. In other words, via a kind of intellectual seminar writ large, right? What you really need is to break, frankly, a lot of these power relations, to break down the power relations that exist. And this is where power comes in, crucially. What to do, how to change the power relations. It's very far, it's very, there's something obviously appealing about the deliberative and discursive view of how democracy should proceed. But it's not clear to me how that view provides the motivational structure, the institutional structure for coming up against the power relations, the power hierarchies, and in particular the oligarchies that are so central to so many representative democracies around the world.
Okay, thanks for the absolutely wonderful answers. I mean, we can we can go on for a few hours on this. So I'll bring some audience questions in. There's one question I will probably ask you at the end if we have time. But so the first question is from Professor Rita Kothari. She writes, the two prepositions that define freedom in its specific context are freedom from and freedom to. The former suggesting direction and place, and the latter more relevant to sense, suggesting potential or action directed towards a goal. Do you feel that Sen is less attentive to the former, but that is freedom from, which in other words may also exemplify the social location of freedom and its genesis? I think it relates to the last point you've just made. And related to this, how do we understand people choosing a situation of less freedom or actually opting for paternalistic regimes? I mean, is there a kind of distinctive understanding of how do we understand this phenomenon, I think, of people perhaps giving themselves to paternalistic regimes or what used to be called voluntary servitude in the largest sense?
It's a great question. I mean, the first thing I'd say is that the freedom to and freedom from distinction is a distinction that's a slight hangover from basically Berlin's work in a way. And I'm not sure that it, especially given Republican accounts and Sen's account and others, I'm not sure that it carries through very well if you start to see freedom in a slightly more holistic way. I mean, that's just like by way of sort of general intro. But yes, there is a sense, I mean, obviously quite a lot of this work is, as we've suggested, is quite abstract, right? So, and a lot of it's ethical. When it's not economic, it's ethical. So it's very much related to viewing things how they could be. Right. Even if the substance is not always being filled in the way that it might be in, say, Martha Nussbaum's work, etc. But so I'm not really going to be able to give you a great answer because I'm not sure the freedom to, freedom for distinction helps us necessarily get anywhere closer towards where the question wants us to go, which is to say, how are we best understanding preference formation, basically, right? How are we best what's the best means of understanding why we're making these choices and leading this kind of life? Right. And I think the prof is absolutely right that there is much less focus on that in Sen's work than on the sort of the typically ethical approach to where we'd like to head to. And that does come back to exactly to what I was just talking about, which is that because of that lack of focus, there's a lack of focus on the reality of real politics, which is all about power, frankly, which is all about I mean, one way of thinking about this is not to use the word choice, right? Is to use the word options. Oh, right. So often politics isn't so much about coercing us to do certain things in a very direct fashion, or manipulating us to do certain things in dodgy fashions, to use a colloquialism. But what a lot of politics is about is about removing options from the table, right? And I'm talking politics with a small p here. So that may be that may be one way of answering in this kind of framework why an individual would opt, given a set of options, for a traditional type arrangement that you might, from a different perspective, view it as an instance of, say, voluntary servitude. Because from that perspective, the perspective of the choice of options, it may not be an instance of choosing voluntary servitude. It may simply be the easiest option on the table.
Oh, that's right. Yeah, that's right. So in a sense, once the menu has been limited already within the framework of that menu, it's it's an easier option. It actually leads nicely into the second question, which I think you've already touched upon actually quite powerfully. But if you want to add something on this, this is from Akshat, which is Amartya Sen requires the theory of democracy to do a lot. He wants it to, amongst other things, adjudicate plural claims to justice. He wants it to get an index of and weights attached to distinct capabilities and functionings. But there is no well articulated theory of democracy within sense or that can do this work. How much of a problem is this for his larger kind of account?
So, I mean, the quick answer is it's a big problem, and it's not such a bad problem. It's a big problem in the sense that you're absolutely right, Akshay, that there is ultimately a huge amount placed upon the democratic process to determine a whole series of things. And when we actually get the analysis of democracy, which remember is only articulated quite late in Sen's oeuvre, even though, of course, he begins with social choice, which is effectively about a certain form of democracy, we only get the real democratic analysis much, much later. And under its deliberative, discursive, impartial, reason-based account, there isn't that much room. But then, of course, first of all, we may not have heard the end of it by now. So Amartya still could easily respond to these criticisms and put something forth. Jean Drez and I have been talking about this a little bit of late, and Jean and Amartya have always had a slight disagreement about this. And it's not impossible that we may hear some more. But of course, more importantly, these are all contributions simply to our concerns around what democracy can and cannot do for us. Right. So maybe it's on our shoulders to right. Carry this forward.
That's right. You can't single-handedly solve any problem. So there's a question kind of that arises out of this discussion, which is on the character of Amartya's egalitarianism. At one level, he gives a very powerful account of how to expand capabilities and freedom. How egalitarian do you think ultimately Amartya's theory is? I mean, and if we were to put it in a kind of crude form that that Jerry Cohen once put it, which is, if you are an egalitarian, how can you tolerate people being rich, as it were? Or a slightly more philosophically sophisticated version, I suppose, would be that to what extent would a capabilities approach actually permit inequalities, particularly material inequalities, and of what kind? Or does the capabilities approach in the end commit Amartya to a perhaps more radical version of economic egalitarianism than is perhaps apparent?
Another great question. The short answer is I think it does. And the reason for that is because I think it's quite difficult to, anywhere, frankly, but particularly in a large nation state like India, which it's important to remember is always in the background or even in the foreground of what a march is doing. I think that it's very difficult to shift the politics and economics of a place like that to a point in which our capabilities, all of our capabilities in that kind of place are being satisfied, brought to fruition, etc., without some very significant redistributive mechanisms. And I would argue also some very significant changes in the political and political economic structure of the place. So I'd suggest that actually there's a quite a radical, deep-rooted egalitarianism running through the substance of the capability approach. What we don't see is that radical, deep egalitarianism manifested in the little bit of politics and political theory that we get towards the end. I think if you were to work through that, as people have done, obviously, but it would be great if more people were doing it in and on India.
Right.
You would, I think, of necessity, require some very significant change.
Right. Right.
But there's one rider to that.
Yeah.
There's one rider to that, and that is, of course, the significance of freedom in all of that.
Right.
So I don't think, and here again, the intellectual history is important. I don't think that what Sen is suggesting is a deep kind of outcomes-based egalitarianism.
That's right.
Because he's definitely a liberal in the sense that he wants to retain a strict account, at least of some form of freedom in that process. So even though the egalitarianism, I think, runs quite deep, it doesn't take him into a Jerry Cohen world of Marxism.
Right. Okay. No, that's. I think that's right. So maybe we'll sort of close with one kind of last question, and then you can sort of have the last one, which is, if you were to ask Amartya Sen one question about your work, about his work, right? For you, sort of something that's puzzling. What would that be in the process of writing this book? Something you've puzzled over and said, I'm sure you've had opportunity to speak to Amartya, but something where you're still not entirely satisfied, you've kind of got this puzzle worked out. What would that puzzle be?
Well, actually, it's a great question. I think I'd have two. The first is, and I've asked him this question from early on, and I've published on it, is why move away from the topic of needs as central? Right. Why introduce this clunky combination of concepts, capability and functions, when in the early work, needs are doing the work?
Right.
And I think the answer is quite an easy answer, is that at the time, that's two marks connected, basically.
Right.
So that's the one thing. But I would argue, and it's just partly an interest of mine, that both an intellectual interest and a political interest is that why ditch needs? Then the second thing would be, I suppose, what we've already been talking about. Why, especially given the substance of so much of his writings, and in particular, I suppose, his writings with Jean Drèze on India. Why don't we see more of this, at least acknowledgement or account of the role that power plays in democracy, the role that different powers and power relations play, and then what effect that has on our view of democracy and our view of operationalizing, to use a horrible new term, the capabilities approach, right? Because he's not just a man of letters and numbers. He's a very practical person. So, it seems to me a rather pertinent question to ask, right? For someone who's concerned with these practical political outcomes.
So is it because, and since just one question has come in which might speak to this, I will sort of impose in your time, but is it because of sort of two reasons? One is, of course, once you take freedom and you're not instrumental about freedom, and there's always a kind of procedural dimension to it. That's in a sense the liberal in Amartya in some ways. But is it also, as Vivan seems to be implicitly suggesting in kind of his analysis, Vivan Gupta, who's asking this question in Amartya's analysis of egalitarianism, uh, does it also have an epistemic dimension having to do with Amartya actually taking Hayek's point about aggregating knowledge through the market systems actually seriously? I mean, and he's always been actually quite candid about it, that once you put kind of that epistemic point and a concern about fair liberal proceduralism, actually it binds you in some ways. I mean, to use an Indian argument, as Dr. Ambedkar would have said, you're reluctant to go down the grammar of anarchy, which is partly where questions of power sometimes take you.
Yes, I mean, basically, I completely agree with that. I think that I think I think it really sums up the problem really well. He's he's it is a dangerous move, but you're right to reference this. I meant to say it earlier. He's absolutely clear. I mean, there's one thing besides the focus on agency and capabilities. There's one thing that he is absolutely clear about, and that lots of more left-wing thinkers have wavered a lot about, and that is that the enabling role of markets, historically and across the world. And so, if you take that seriously, and I agree with him there completely, if you take that seriously, then of course you do have to leave room for the freedom and the epistemic issues that you're speaking about.
So on that note, Lawrence, just wanted to, on behalf of Ashoka Economics Society, thank you very much for this conversation on a Sunday. I know the demands in your time, so we are deeply grateful. I hope it will instigate many of our students to pick up your book and pick up more of Amartya's work. You can't in some senses escape it. But we are deeply grateful to you. Sahil, do you want to say something, since you put all of this together?
I would like to thank both the guests for taking out the time. And judging from how fascinating this conversation has been, I would urge all the attendees to go through the book because this seems like a fascinating read. So thank you for joining us.
Yes, and the recording of this will be available. So that was part of the purpose. So within Ashoka. So thanks so much, Lawrence, and hope our paths can cross in person somewhere soon.
Let me say, Pratap, thank you again to the Ashoka Society and Economic Society, and to you. That was some fantastic, stimulating conversation. Some really great questions, and I do really hope that our paths can cross. If I get my chair renewed, I will. I'll try and make it happen for sure, at least on this side. And if this crisis we're living through comes to an end, then I'll make sure I get to India and Ashoka as soon as I can.
Okay, thank you so much. Thanks, Lawrence.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Bye-bye.